I was listening to Kanye West's magnum opus, My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy, last week, and for the 100th time, I found myself thinking about the deep sadness of Kanye West's journey. He went from a producer making beats for Jay-Z to an all-time great hip-hop artist who completely transformed the genre with albums like 808s and Heartbreak and Yeezus. Don't get it twisted. These albums are the forebears of the sound that made artists like Drake and Travis Scott international megastars. At the same time, Kanye's mental health rapidly spiraled, and he went from the likable asshole who knew he was the greatest to do it — he had a song on Yeezus that was literally titled I Am God — to a Nazi-supporting megalomaniac and relative social pariah. I haven't met Kanye, and I don't know him well enough to diagnose him with a mental disorder. But his public behavior has led many folks to believe that Kanye West has narcissistic personality disorder. In light of these ruminations, in this video, I will analyze the DSM-5's definition and diagnostic criteria of narcissistic personality disorder. The DSM-5 defines the diagnostic criteria for narcissistic personality disorder as such: a pervasive pattern of grandiosity in fantasy or behavior, need for admiration, and lack of empathy, beginning by early adulthood and present in a variety of contexts, as indicated by 5 or more of the following. 1. A grandiose sense of self-importance. 2. Preoccupied with fantasies of unlimited success, power, brilliance, beauty, or ideal love. 3. Believes that he or she is special, unique, and should only mingle with other special or high-status individuals. 4. Requires excessive admiration. 5. Has a sense of entitlement. 6. Is interpersonally exploitative. 7. Lacks empathy, is unwilling to recognize or identify with the feelings and needs of others. 8. Is often envious of others or believes that others are envious of him or her. And 9. Shows arrogant, haughty behaviors or attitudes. Almost all of these behaviors require interpersonal interactions to come to fruition. Ironically, someone with narcissistic personality disorder needs to interact with other people to fulfill the criteria listed in the DSM-5. The DSM mentions that people with narcissistic personality disorder have a very fragile self-esteem and require others to view them favorably to fully function in society. Many people with this disorder fear rejection and criticism, which may lead them to withdraw from society to avoid embarrassment or a perceived negative perception of themselves. I believe that narcissistic personality disorder is a real disorder, and the DSM-5 manages to accurately capture many of its symptoms and signs. But any evaluation of the disorder must recognize that the patient's behavior in a clinical setting is not necessarily indicative of whether or not someone may actually be suffering from narcissistic personality disorder. A fear of rejection and a desire to be held in high esteem, coupled with a willingness to exploit and deceive others, means that someone with narcissistic personality disorder may be wary of receiving anything resembling a sick label, and thus may change their behavior in a clinical setting to avoid diagnosis. Additionally, its diagnosis relies upon value judgments. This person with NPD is interpersonally exploitative, and that is a bad thing. In this video, I will argue that narcissistic personality disorder is a moral disorder as opposed to a medical disorder, due to the method of treatment required for it, and thus requires the DSM to recognize that those with NPD may not be fully cooperative or truthful in the diagnostic process. Before I completely delve into my argument, I believe that we should first establish that the DSM does make moral judgments within the diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder. A lack of empathy is the most obvious sign of this in the criteria, but it also mentions a willingness to exploit others. These are not medical terms, but normative terms. We expect humans to be empathetic and unexploitative, and a lack of those characteristics, along with the presence of what I call general narcissism, meets the criteria for NPD. By making this moral judgment, the DSM obligates treatment to include the patient's acknowledgement that they, in some way or another, have committed moral failures. If the patient cannot do that, then the delusion continues and the disorder cannot be treated. As Charlin says, you cannot be fully cured of antisocial, borderline, histrionic, or narcissistic personality disorder and regularly intend to be systematically cruel, dishonest, and indifferent to the feelings of others. Lewis Charland differentiates between natural disorders, which exist regardless of diagnosis or the patient's awareness of the symptoms involved with a given disorder, and interactive disorders. Interactive disorders means that a person changes their behavior depending on their diagnosis or classification. Charland says that interactive disorders have a looping effect because of this. A person with hyperactivity might end up acting more hyperactive due to their knowledge of their diagnosis. In our case, someone with narcissistic personality disorder may act more narcissistic in public after diagnosis. Charland ultimately labels narcissistic personality disorder as a moral disorder by the very fact that the treatment of cluster B personality disorders, which narcissistic personality disorder is a part of, requires what he calls a moral commitment to therapy. There must be both a moral willingness and moral effort on the part of the patient to achieve true change. But what does this exactly mean? Charland uses William Tuke's York Retreat as an example. Tuke instilled a family atmosphere among the inmates and institutional members, games, gardening, household chores, all in a system governed by kindness. Therapy sought to nurture morality in inmates with a stated goal of what Charland calls an appeal to the desire for self-esteem. According to Charland, this treatment was very successful for inmates. But if the method of treatment for NPD requires a moral change, then it follows that the very diagnosis for narcissistic personality disorder relies upon a set of moral failures that have been willingly given to a clinical professional by someone who is afraid of ever seeming like a failure. We must change the DSM to recognize how a patient's words and actions can imply the presence of diagnostic features related to NPD, even if they themselves are unwilling to confirm their presence. For instance, if a patient knows that feeling special or unique is part of the diagnostic criteria for NPD and does not want to be labeled as such, they may say that they do not feel special or unique. But their language and telling a story about themselves may still give that diagnostic feature away to a professional. If all of their stories include some grand achievement of theirs or attempts to fish for compliments, they may fulfill some criteria for NPD. If they never even mention minor failures or attempt to brush over them in a diagnostic setting, it could mean that they are afraid of seeming lesser. My ultimate point is that if a moral change is required for treatment, we must assume that the patient is initially morally lacking in some manner, and the diagnosis of such a disorder also requires an unadulterated view of the patient's actions. How do they act when they think no one is watching? Obviously, you cannot spy on somebody just because you suspect they have NPD, but you can talk to their family, friends, and coworkers during the diagnostic process. You can hear stories of how they treat their siblings. Would anyone they know refer to them as loyal, empathetic, or humble? Asking these questions reveals far more about the patient than any direct line of questioning could. It is logically incoherent to simultaneously hold that someone is both in need of a moral change and also completely trustworthy in their response to a professional attempting to diagnose them with what the patient might perceive as a failure. Some people with NPD may be totally forthcoming in their responses, but it is likely that a solid portion of those with NPD would attempt to deceive a clinician to avoid diagnosis. My argument might seem at odds with Charland's theory that people with NPD are subject to a looping effect, that their diagnosis makes them act more narcissistic, but it is not. My argument contends that the patient would hide their narcissistic inclinations during an attempt to diagnose them. They have not yet been diagnosed with NPD. While their behavior may change after diagnosis, I argue that their unwillingness to be perceived as a failure would override their desire to be properly diagnosed. Thus, my argument does not dismiss the looping theory. The DSM must add that background knowledge of the patient from people that know the patient is required for diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder. It must also recognize that a patient may be untruthful in a clinical setting to avoid diagnosis. I agree with Charland that people with NPD and other cluster B personality disorders require a moral willingness to achieve a moral change. But this conclusion necessarily means that the patient is lacking in some moral department before diagnosis. They are not evil, but their trustworthiness must be called into question, especially when we consider their unwillingness to appear as a failure to others. Most people without personality disorders lie to themselves about their virtues. Why would someone who is entitled and egotistical be likely to admit their own failures or even recognize them? To end this video, I would like to say that I do not believe that diagnosis and treatment of narcissistic personality disorder falls within the purview of medical practice. This is a fundamental problem in living. But it warrants inclusion in the DSM because it is currently our best practical method of diagnosing it, with my changes, of course. While someone like Maddox may argue that we are pathologizing behaviors we view as abnormal, I argue that it is the duty of society to hold everyone to a certain moral standard. If someone cannot meet that moral standard, we are obligated to help them, like William Tuke did. I think that Tuke's method of treating cluster B personality disorders is the path forward, and I wouldn't mind if Kanye West paid him a visit. Thank you for watching my video, and I hope you enjoyed it.